Recently, we released a quick video on how to change your oil on it with a dry sump system, and we received some questions about the video, and we're here today to answer those questions.
All right, so the first question, Mike, what are the maintenance routines for the trans and the rear?
So I'll break this down. We'll start with the transmission. I try to change the oil in the transmission every time I change the oil in the engine. So anytime I reach 100, 150, 200 laps, I'll change the oil in the transmission by just draining it and filling it back up. It takes, for a Burt Gen 2, it takes like 3/4 of a quart. It's not very expensive, so it's cheap insurance to change the oil. When you pull the bottom plug out, there's a magnet on it. You can tell how much of the clutches are wearing, which tells you, are you doing a good job not slipping it too much and stuff like that. Obviously, when we do some of the big races like Super Dirt Week, with pit stops, it's harder on the clutch. If you load your car in the trailer by driving it in and not using a winch, it's harder on the clutch. So you might want to change your oil a little more often. You might want to get your transmission serviced more often in those situations. But normally I would get the transmission rebuilt once a season if you're racing like less than 20 races on your car. If you're gonna do like say 40 races in a season with one car, then you better do it mid-season. So onto the rear end, you're changing gears often, then you don't have to change the oil as often because a little bit of oil comes out when you change the gears. If you run the same track every week and you never change the gears, then I would suggest every 3 races or so to drain the whole rear end and fill it back up with new oil. I'm not a big fan of filtering the oil when you change the gears because a lot of the oils have additives in them that would be filtered out by doing that. So if you're going to reuse the oil, you want to have a clean pan to pour it back in and not have to use a filter. A big screen might not hurt. Very coarse screen, because then you could, if there's happened to be something big that fell in there, then it would catch that. But there's also a magnet on the drain plug for the rear. So if you're changing the gears all the time and not changing the oil as often, I would still suggest pulling that plug out and inspecting it to see if there's a lot of metal on the plug every few races. There's a lot of other service you can do every few races on the rear as well. But as far as the oil, that's what I would do.
How are you counting laps? Is it every lap you run or just under the green laps?
I only count the green laps, but you do have to kind of put in consideration that if you're running a rough track or a heavy track, the laps might as well count as double. And if you're running on a slick track all the time, they hardly really matter. So depending on what type of track you're running, it really affects how you count the laps. And so I'd say I change the engine oil every 100 laps. If I ran a 50 lapper on a really heavy rough track, I might change the oil after 1 race. But say I ran 3 races on a really slick track that really didn't have a lot of traction, I might go a 4th race on it because you're really not being that hard on anything. So I wouldn't be too obsessive about the actual number of laps as much as like how hard are the laps. But I only count the green flag laps. Caution laps obviously are not hard on the engine. So
now, how often do you change the oil?
So I like to change my oil every 100 to 200 laps. But again, based on how hard the laps were. So If they were easier laps, I might go closer to 100 laps. Or sorry, 200. If they're easier laps, I might go closer to 200 laps. But if they were harder laps, I would go closer to 100. Or even if it was very hard on the engine, I might just do one race. Or
In the longer distance races, do you notice the oil changing colors?
most races, I don't notice the oil changing colors. But I lean towards the side of changing my oil pretty often, probably more than some people do. So typically when I drain my oil, it looks similar color to when I put it in. If you're waiting a long time, a lot more than 100 to 200 laps to change your oil, then you may see the color of the oil change because there's things diluting the oil, such as you can have contaminants such as worn parts like aluminum, metal, brass. You can have fuel, exhaust contaminating your oil. So if you change the oil more often, you'll likely see less color change. And if you're seeing the color change, you're probably not changing the oil often enough.
So our last question. If I find metal in the filter, how do I know whether it's a normal amount or if it's a catastrophic failure?
So metal in the filter is kind of a feel thing. I've had different engines from different engine builders. Some seem to make a lot of metal in the filter and still lasts a long time. I know that's hard to believe, but some of them, and then it's hard to read it too. You know, there's a lot of other things in the screen filter besides metal. So just seeing a lot of stuff on the filter doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. When it's bad is if you never see anything on the filter and then all of a sudden now you're seeing a big change in your screen filter on your weekly basis. So if you check it every week or every race and it's consistently 50% saturated, then you know everything's status quo, right? But if it's 25% every week and then all of a sudden now it's 75%, then you probably need to start looking a little further to see if something is wrong. It's a good, consistent check to see if everything's normal. And normal can be different for different engines. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you have any more questions, please comment below. If you like this video, please share it. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.